Henry VIII, is he the most famous of all English monarchs? Well, he ought to be, because he had the best propagandist. This chap, German painter Hans Holbein the Younger, who created the image of the man that was Henry Tudor.
Hello and welcome to the series Henry VIII, The Reign, An Old Tale of Wives, and this the first episode titled The State of Christendom. I'm Mark Holinshed, and as visitors to the website Henry VIII, The Reign will have gathered, I've been looking at the reign of Henry VIII for some years now. And so maybe I can start by thanking the many thousands of visitors each year for your continued interest in the site and the subject. Thank you indeed. I began work some time ago now on taking some of the website content and turning it into a video. But it actually started as a podcast, but I thought, no, let's have some pictures, illustrations, maps, maybe a diagram or two or three or quite a few actually, along with some narration, commentary and so forth. And so here we are with the first instalment on video. I've done it because I would like to show you, not tell you, not lecture you, not lecture you in the vein of Henry did this, Henry did that, Henry like this, Henry like that, or tell you that Henry and Anne changed the world. I don't want to be one of those talking heads. I'd like to share with you, as we seem to say these days, I would like to share with you what I've discovered along the way. In what follows, the events of the reign remain unchanged. The events still all happened, but the motivations behind them are explained somewhat differently to those house brick-sized books written over the decades in an attempt to explain the behaviour of Henry VIII. So, we shall tarry no further, turn the waffle button to off, and I'll show you what I've found out.
So, back to Holbein and his portrayal of Henry VIII. We all know it well. There are several versions copied from Holbein's original, which was actually a life-size mural painted to grace the Privy Chamber at the Palace of Whitehall. The palace, unfortunately, was destroyed by fire in 1698. Nonetheless, reproductions of that image were in circulation, and it became the template for most of the impressions that followed. And so we are left with this imposing image of a supremely confident-looking man, towering above all those who stood about him, likely to face down those who even dare think about defiance of his sovereignty. And although the images are silent, from somewhere in this portrayal is a great booming voice of authority. In addition, this depiction has attracted accusations of gluttony, drunkenness, fornication, and even lechery. 500 years later, and that portrayal hasn't really changed.
I'm mad for you. I dream of you at night. I long for you by day. I'm no good with any other woman. I think of nothing but you. Of you and me playing dog and bitch. Of you and me playing horse and mare. Of you and me in every way. I want to fill you up night after night. I want to fill you up with sons.
Bastards. They would be bastards.
One word more and I'll strike you. One word more.
Without marriage, if you and I have sons, they will be bastards.
This is Henry's Psalter, his private book of psalms, which includes annotations in his own hand. It is likely, as a devout Christian, this small book would have accompanied him where'er he went. Today it's kept in the British Library, and to quote from its description of the exhibit, it is said, commissioned by Henry VIII, this Psalter is the most sumptuous production of the French scribe and illuminator Jean Mallard. Several images depict Henry as King David. The annotations in Henry's own hand show how strongly he identified with the godly Old Testament king. And so to my mind, for a portrayal of the king, the Psalter deserves as much, if not more attention than the Holbein work, and all those copies that came after Holbein. Unlike the copyists, the Frenchman Mallard does not follow the German Holbein in his perception and portrayal of Henry VIII. Every picture tells a story, don't it? Why then is it that we continue to accept the hard-man Henry version over and above the more simple and thus probably more accurate and certainly more personal portrayal of the man who was Henry VIII?
The drama event of the year reaches its shattering conclusion.
I am your king.
Only as long as I allow you to live.
Ray Winston and Sean Bean star in the ITV drama premiere, Henry VIII, Sunday at 9 on ITV1.
I think it's fair to say that portrayal is more in the style of Holbein than Mallard. But what is Henry VIII famous for, apart from that Holbein painting and everything that flowed from it? How do we know him? What do we know of the man himself? This man, the product of a German portrait artist, this oh-so-famous king. But what was the man's legacy? What part did Henry Tudor really play in the history of England? Did he really play the lead? Or was he just a bit part player?
Well, he had 6 wives. He was inclined towards sport when he was young, and then probably ate and drank too much as he aged, which caused him serious and probably terminal health problems. He was beyond all doubt religious and a lifelong Catholic. What else? He had a son with a mistress, Elizabeth Blount, years before the future Edward VI was born. But aside from that, there's not a great deal more to add about the man who was Henry VIII, save to say he was something of a gullible nitwit. Of all the historians who have studied the Tudor period, one of the finest and most prolific was Sir Geoffrey Elton. Sir Geoffrey wrote extensively about the history of the 16th century, producing invaluable work on the Constitution, the law, the Reformation, of course, and even the discipline of history itself. But when he turned his attention to the man that was Henry VIII, well, he covered that subject in just 27 and a bit pages. And they were small pages at that. Yes, this is it. Within these few pages, he says, we surely cannot accept an argument unsupported by evidence which ascribes to Henry VIII alone the mastery of events, the making of policy, and the detailed and specific government of the country. Unsupported by evidence, says Sir Geoffrey. Quite a charge indeed. But he was quite right. There is no evidence, not a scintilla of it. And for that very reason, this series is not about Henry VIII the man. It's about the reign of Henry VIII and the people who did have mastery of events, the people who did make policy, the people who did set down the detail specifically for the government of the country, and the people who arranged all 6 of his political marriages. Now, to put Henry in his proper place, which is on the sidelines and for the most part looking in the wrong direction, does not change the occurrence of events. The 6 marriages, the divorces, the execution, the death in childbirth and the survival, they all happened. The wars and the peace with France, the lack of a legitimately born heir, the break from Rome, the pilgrimage of grace, the dissolution of the monasteries, so on and so forth. It all happened. But the reasoning behind so much of the decision-making during the reign of Henry VIII is difficult to understand, and in many areas still lacks adequate explanation. Much of the government of the kingdom during his reign appears to be, well, nonsensical. You turn this way, I'll turn that.
France is our enemy. No, France is our friend. No, wait, France is our enemy again. All be Catholics, then all be Protestants, then all be halfway in between. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Those 6 wives. How do you make sense of that? That and so many other idiosyncrasies. There is a way. Actually, it's more akin to a well-trodden path, but there is a way to avoid deeper explanation, and it was devised to disguise the nonsense. Quite simple, really. What you do is you apply the word tyrant to Henry VIII. Now, once you've done that, any square peg will fit in any round hole, and vice versa. His tyranny explains all that occurred. No. That is too easy, and it's too simple, and frankly serves merely to brush the facts under the carpet, and as a consequence renders the history all the more bizarre. In a completely new look, this series takes us from the early 1500s to the dissolution legislation at the end of the Reformation Parliament in 1536. It will show in particular that the break from Rome was not a consequence of any desire that Henry VIII might have had to marry Anne de Boulogne, otherwise known as Anne Boleyn. In this, the first episode titled The State of Christendom, we will look at the rulers on the continent of Europe at the turn of the 16th century and examine the balance of power and geography, all of which set the stage for one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of England. We will familiarise ourselves with the dynastic ambitions of Catherine of Aragon's Trastamara family, the enormous territories of the Habsburgs of Austria and Germany, the domineering Valois of France, and the hitherto ambitious Tudors of England. And of course, the vast spiritual and temporal authority of the Papacy. In amongst all the dynastic grandeur, there was one man, a commoner, a layman, who rose to incredible heights, drawn by an insatiable desire for power. The power that he craved had been created over centuries. This man was Thomas Wolsey, and the power that he craved was that of the papacy, the papal office. He wanted to be pope, and it was that insatiable lust for authority that ultimately led to the overturn of the old medieval order. And so in this series, titled An Old Tale of Wives, let us begin to understand the course of events. This image represents an overview of the rulers of Christendom in the late 1400s and the early 1500s. We should maybe start with some of the more familiar names and faces. Here, England is ruled under Henry VII. Henry had 2 sons, the eldest, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur, however, died in 1502, aged just 15. His second son was Prince Henry, and after Arthur's death, Henry became heir to the throne. If we were then to travel south in Christendom, overseas, here in Spain, was its ruler, King Ferdinand of Aragon.
Away to the east, over the Alps, way over on the other side of the continent, in Austria, was Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor and the reigning head of the mighty Habsburg dynasty. As Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian ruled over Austria, the German states and the Low Countries, the area we know today as the Netherlands and Belgium. The Low Countries were governed on the Emperor's behalf by his son and heir, Philip, Duke of Burgundy. Now let's go back to Ferdinand in Spain and meet his offspring. The king and his queen, Isabella of Castile, had 2 daughters. They actually had several children, a number of which died in infancy. But it's the daughters that concern us now, and they were Joanna of Castile and Catherine of Aragon. Ferdinand was a shrewd sort of chap, and he had the elder sister, Joanna, married Duke Philip of Burgundy. Catherine, of course, was married initially to Prince Arthur. He died, as we know, and Catherine was left high and dry in England for about 7 years until after the death of Henry VII. She then married the youthful new king, Henry VIII. For Henry to marry Arthur's widow, a papal dispensation was granted, the legality of which caused some disquiet later in the reign of Henry VIII. Now, as you can see, in the middle of all this was France, and France looks rather lonely, as it was, because the kingdom was now surrounded by unions in matrimony, political marriages arranged by 3 rulers, Maximilian, Ferdinand, and Henry VII. They were, all of them, hostile towards France. Now you can probably see where this was all going, because if Philip and Joanna were to produce a male heir, that heir would, in time, unify Ferdinand's kingdom with Maximilian's empire. Added to that formidable power, there was also the influential dynastic union with the Tudors of England through Henry and Catherine. Henry and Catherine, as we know, had a daughter, Mary, in 1516. However, in 1500, Joanna and Philip did have a son, Charles. But then, just 6 years later, the Habsburgs suffered a cruel twist of fate. Philip, Charles's father, died. He was just 28 years old. Young Charles, as we shall see, becomes a lead player in this period of English history. Yes, this young man from Ghent in modern-day Belgium would become one of the principal protagonists in the events leading up to and during the Reformation in England. We met Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, briefly, and his son Philip, who in turn was the father of young Archduke Charles. As I mentioned, they were members of the Habsburg family, the senior line of the Habsburg dynasty. It would be very difficult to overstate the power and influence of the Habsburgs,
which from the early 1400s and into the 1500s was, well, it was enormous. And as the new century moved on, they became even stronger, even more dominant, and even more authoritative. The Habsburgs took their name from Habsburg Castle, built in 1020. It still stands today, 20 or so miles northwest of Zurich, in present-day Switzerland. The family first occupied the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in 1438 and held it without interruption until 1742, and then again in 1745 until the empire was dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. There was something of a medieval corporation, really, which in this case, rather than by acquisition, expanded through a whole series of dynastic marriages. The family produced kings of Bohemia, Hungary, Croatia, Galatia, Portugal, and Spain, together with the principalities in the Low Countries and Italy. They were emperors in Austria, Austria-Hungary, and into South America as emperors of Mexico. This was a dynasty not to be underestimated, so much so that when the time came, they did not back away from a toe-to-toe fight with the butcher's boy from Ipswich. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop of York and Papal Legate, was, so the story goes, a butcher's boy from Ipswich. He attended Ipswich School, which began educating its pupils back in the 1300s, and continues to do precisely that today. Now, he would have been allowed to attend that school if his father was a senior member of the local Merchants' Guild or a high-ranking burgess in the town. Let's be frank, a butcher by trade may be, but he was also a man of honour and wealth, because from there his son went to Magdalen College School in Oxford, and then to Magdalen College itself, where he became known as the Boy Bachelor, because he earned his degree aged just 15. Wolsey became a member of the clergy in 1498 when he was ordained at Marlborough, but he continued on at Oxford as master of the college school. In 1502 he became chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry VIII no less, and then when the Archbishop died the following year, he became a servant, that is to say an employee, of Richard Nanfan of Burts Morton in Worcestershire. Nanfan was also Knight Deputy of Calais. Following Nanfan's death, Wolsey then joined Henry VII's court and became the king's chaplain. In royal service, Wolsey came under the wing of the Bishop of Westminster, Richard Fox, who at the beginning of young Henry VIII's reign in 1509, the Venetian ambassador referred to Fox as the Alter Rex, implying that the bishop carried more authority than the youthful young king, and indeed that Fox was the king in all but name. Wolsey would inherit that same unofficial title, Alter Rex. By 1511, Wolsey was well on course to oversee Fox's impending, if not entirely voluntary, retirement. He set about cozying up to the Habsburgs and their anti-French policy. So Wolsey began his international political career as a bosom pal of the Habsburgs and their alliance with Spain. Speaking over 20 years later,
on the 11th of May 1532, Henry sent a message to the members of the Reformation Parliament, and it read, "I thought that the clergy of my realm had been my subjects wholly, but now I have well perceived that they be but half my subjects, yea, and scarce my subjects, for all the prelates at their consecration make an oath to the Pope, clean contrary to the oath that they make to me, so that they seem to be his subjects and not mine." The Cardinal had been the de facto ruler of England for almost 2 decades. As a clergyman, at his ordination in 1498, he made an oath, as Henry correctly stated, to the Pope, clean contrary to the oath that he made to the King, so that he seemed to be his, that is to say, the Pope's subject, and not the English sovereigns. And so he had been, the Pope's subject, and not Henry VIII's. Wolsey was a man of the Papacy, that is to say, the papal office, and loyal to the Pope of the day. But he became more than that. Wolsey, in all he did, was driven by an insatiable ambition to become Pope himself, and so the most powerful man in Christendom. The Cardinal and Queen Catherine of Aragon became the most bitter enemies, and she came to loathe the man. However, in the second decade of the 16th century, she was his ticket to the top, or so he thought. After all, her father was King of Spain, her husband bore the title King of England, and her nephew was the presumed heir to the Holy Roman Empire. What better friend could a wannabe Pope wish for? So the manipulative Wolsey cozied up to the powerful Habsburgs. Here we are in Christendom and all that Wolsey coveted. In 1511, Pope Julius, threatened by French influence in the north of the Italian peninsula, formed a Holy League. That is to say, an alliance of nations, which was essentially everyone in Christendom against the French. Since 1494, northern Italy had been a flashpoint. And the Italian wars, as the conflict or indeed conflicts are usually known, continued on and off until 1559. Although at some point or another most states in Christendom were drawn into the hostilities, the power struggle was principally between the Habsburgs of the Empire and the Valois of the Kingdom of France. The Italian peninsula was largely wealthy, but there were enormous political divisions among its numerous states. The volatile north of the peninsula became a battleground for European supremacy, which inevitably involved the Papacy and the Papal States, and very much influenced the history of England. To have a proper understanding of the conflicts, we need to have a brief look at the geography, which to a large degree dictated events. To the north and west of our hotspot, our flashpoint over the Alps, lay France. To the north and east were territories controlled by the Holy Roman Emperor, Austria, the German states, and the Low Countries. To the east, the Duchy of Mantua and the Republic of Venice. To the southeast, the Papal States, Parma, Modena, Bologna, Romagna, and of course Rome.
Beyond there, to the south and east, the Kingdom of Naples, which for the most part was subject to rule from Spain. With the birth of Archduke Charles, it was pretty well inevitable, as indeed did happen, that he one day would become ruler of Ferdinand's Spain and Maximilian's numerous regions. However, a glance at the map quickly identifies a problem, and that was the difficulty of travelling between the two. The domains were separated, one in the north and one in the south of Christendom. Kingdom and empire would be politically connected, but geographically very much split, and by no small distance, which while France remained hostile, there was an enormous logistical problem. Realistically, there were only two routes available between the kingdom and empire, neither of which was particularly safe for travel. There was the east coast of Spain from, say, Barcelona to probably Genoa and vice versa. But even if the voyager of the day survived the threat of the French warships coming from the west, there was still the danger of the Muslim Turk coming from the east. Even if the sea journey was a safe one, an arduous overland trip lay ahead. The long trek north, home to the empire, and the safety of that journey very much depended on who was in control of the Duchy of Milan. Yes, the Duchy of Milan, the very place we call Flashpoint, Northern Italy. The other route, the second route, was from a port in the north of Spain, perhaps Bilbao or Santander, north through the Bay of Biscay and the Atlantic into the English Channel. From there, so long, and this is important, so long as the relations were good with England, there was the option to land at, say, Falmouth or Southampton and travel overland to London. We'll leave the geography there for the time being, with a note that it is pivotal to the entire history of the age, and indeed history per se owes much to the geography of the English Channel and the Strait of Dover. In England, Wolsey was the de facto ruler, and as a clergyman, his first loyalty was to the Pope, or rather the papal office. After all, he'd taken an oath to pledge just that. As far as Wolsey was concerned, if the Pope wanted a war with France, the Pope would have. And so, from his position as the King's Almoner, he came up with a harebrained scheme that Henry should send an invasion force all that way by sea to reclaim England's lost territories in Aquitaine in the south of France. In June 1512, with the Pope having granted an indulgence to the English invasion force, that is to say, papal forgiveness for their sins, and with Henry's father-in-law Ferdinand offering support from Spain, the English departed Southampton. As the king waved them off, he said they were marvellously encouraged by the messages from the Pope. The ships duly turned up at San Sebastian 2 weeks later. They began to prepare for an incursion into Aquitaine. But there was no sign of Ferdinand and Ferdinand's promise of ordnance, or than his horses and his troops. The reason being that Ferdinand had used the English assault as a diversion and taken his own army instead to claim the French-occupied territory of Navarre. The King of Spain had taken his son-in-law for a nitwit. Needless to say, the English were forced to cut and run, and they returned home looking rather silly. The following year, Henry, or rather Wolsey, following papal strategy at all costs, had another go at invading France, this time without Ferdinand in Spain, but with the Habsburgs, Maximilian, and Maximilian's daughter, Margaret. In the summer of 1513, in something like the spirit of Henry V, an army invaded the north of France. On this occasion, 22-year-old Henry VIII was with them. However, rather than being a rerun of Agincourt, this particular excursion owes its fame, dubious as that may be, to the so-called Battle of the Spurs, because the French apparently spurred on their horses in panic to flee the victorious English army. The army captured a couple of French towns before returning home. The campaigning season was over for another year. His other claim to fame originates at Lille and is the after-party at the court of Maximilian's daughter, Margaret of Savoy. It seems that she and Charles Brandon had rather too much of, well, pretty well everything, really. Nonetheless, meanwhile, at home in England, Catherine of Aragon was acting as governor, and in Henry's absence, along with Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, soundly defeated an invasion force from Scotland at the far more famous and far more convincing Battle of Flodden, in which King James of Scotland lost his life. However, in February 1513, the architect of the Holy League, Pope Julius II, had died, and Leo X became Pope. Leo, as he settled in as new head of the Roman Universal Church, decided he would not be the figurehead for the ongoing war in Christendom, particularly as the real enemy of the Christians, as he saw it, were the so-called Muslim Turks. Wolsey was rewarded for his devotion to the papacy, a loyalty beyond anything he owed to the king. He was appointed Bishop of Lincoln in February 1514, and again, so far as he was concerned, if the Pope wanted peace in Christendom, with an end to hostilities in France, that is exactly what Wolsey would set out to achieve. However, to advance that policy, he must overcome an obstacle. That obstacle came in the form of Cardinal, Archbishop of York, Papal Legate, an English ambassador to the Pope. His name was Christopher Bainbridge. Bainbridge was vehemently anti-French. He had fought alongside Pope Julius in his campaigns against the French. And as a military legate, led a division of the Papal army against pro-French forces, and at the same time he was guarding what he perceived to be Henry VIII's interests, which did not include friendship with Louis of France. While we still have Bainbridge with us, we'll just for a moment turn to this man, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's first minister in the 1530s. who in more recent times has received renewed fame through the novel Wolf Hall and its sequels. Now, given the closeness of the Cromwell family to Southwell in Nottinghamshire and Battersea in the historic county of Surrey, both of which had manifest links with the ecclesiastical province of York, it seems reasonable to presume that if Thomas Cromwell did spend time in military service in Italy, it would have been alongside Archbishop of York Bainbridge. We do know for certain that Cromwell was in Rome on legal business during Bainbridge's time there. Notwithstanding, Bainbridge continued his belligerent anti-French policy even after Leo had been elected, and was forthright in his opposition to the readmission of French cardinals to the papal establishment. To Wolsey, fearful of the papal ambassador's influence over a young and naive king, Bainbridge was a nuisance. But he was not a nuisance for long, because by mid-July he was dead, poisoned, in Rome. Just 8 weeks later, Wolsey himself succeeded Bainbridge as the Archbishop of York.
I'm getting married in the morning. Ding dong, the bells are gonna chime. Pull out the stopper, let's have a whopper, but get me to the church on time.
Now, at the same time Wolsey was adopting a new papal strategy, so Henry VIII was planning a wedding. His younger sister, Mary, since back in 1507, had been betrothed to the young Archduke Charles. Henry was absorbed in making the arrangements for the lavish wedding ceremony. He would be the host, and the wedding was to be celebrated on the French side of the Strait of Dover in the English-controlled Pale of Calais. And lavish indeed it was planned to be. For example, there's a receipt for £128, 8 shillings and 4pence for timber and necessity for scaffolds, tents, houses and pavilions for the jousts to be held in Calais. Then there's a set of instructions to the English ambassadors dated February 1514. They're instructed to arrange furniture for Mary's bedchamber in Calais. And not just her bedchamber, but the additional 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th chambers, and to make arrangements for her stable. Then they were to establish what is required for the 3 chambers of the Emperor, and for Charles, and for Charles's Aunt Margaret. It goes on to tell us, or more to the point, they tell the ambassadors, the Emperor will be lodged where the late Deputy of Calais lived, Charles in the Staple House, Margaret in the Treasurer's house, and the King in the castle at Calais. Henry will pay for all his sister's apparel, and so on and so forth. And this is my favourite piece from these instructions. The King will provide all the apparel for the chambers of the Emperor, for Charles and my Lady Margaret, except the beds, which it is thought they will, for their better ease, bring with them. Which in my rough translation means, we'll supply the bed linen, they bring their own beds. However, home comforts aside, in France, King Louis was an ageing widow in dire need of a male heir. Henry was at the stage of drawing up the seating arrangements for the wedding when Wolsey announced a new plan altogether. The wedding was off. Was off. Finito. Kaput. Gone. After 7 years of betrothal, organised by her father, Mary would not now marry Charles after all. Instead, Wolsey, in compliance with the Pope's wishes for peace with France, had only gone and negotiated a peace agreement with the old French king. And so now Mary would marry him instead. And it gets worse. With the intention of providing the old king with an heir. Ooh. We know that Mary was horrified at the prospect that when Wolsey said jump, the young Tudors, well, they jumped. And Henry VIII's sister was shipped off to be the Queen of France. The marriage lasted less than 3 months before Louis dropped dead. Maybe of the gout, maybe of overexertion, probably both. In any event, Mary left France without a child. With no direct heir, the next King of France was Louis's 21-year-old son-in-law, the Duke of Valois, Francis, whose wife was the old king's daughter, Claude. Francis was the son of Charles, Count of Angoulême, who had died back in 1496, leaving Francis's mother, Louise of Savoy, a widow with 2 young children. The new king also had an older sister, Marguerite of Angoulême. Both mother and daughter would have enormous influence on events, including the history of England, for which they received far too little attention in the history books. The House of Valois had come to the French throne in 1328 when Charles IV died without an heir. The claim was disputed because Isabella of France, the she-wolf, mother of Edward III of England, claimed the throne for her son. Her father had been until 1314 Philip IV of France. But unlike the English, the French did not recognise inheritance of the throne via the female line. And so Philip, Count of Valois, was crowned King of France. Edward III was pretty upset about that, as indeed were his successors. Some long years of tension followed, and during that time the French confiscated the English territory of Aquitaine in the south of France, the region Wolsey had tried and failed to reclaim in 1512. Following the confiscation, somewhat inevitably, with Edward claiming kingship over France, a war followed, the 100 Years' War, which gave rise over the following, well, it was 115 years actually, to some of the most famous people and events in English history. Agincourt, the Battle of Rochelle, the death of the Black Prince, Black Monday, John of Gaunt, Joan of Arc, Archbishop Thomas Arundel, Henry's IV and V, and into the reign of Henry VI, when all seemed lost. And frankly, it was all lost, except for the Pale of Calais. England, in reality, would never again be in the position to take sovereignty over France. But then Wolsey had come along and put the idea of lost, nay, stolen grandeur into Henry VIII's head and manipulated the authority invested in the gullible king to serve his own ecclesiastical ambitions. He convinced the king that it was his sovereign duty to wage war on France and so reclaim the kingdom and avenge his ancestors,
thus safeguarding the inherent rights of his own descendants. Before concluding this episode, we should foreshadow, if you like, ahead of episode 2, albeit briefly for now, 3 people who were central to the composition of the Reformation in England. Two of those people I mentioned a few moments ago, Louise of Savoy and her daughter Marguerite of Angoulême, and the third Anne was the daughter of the English ambassador to France, Thomas Boulogne. Louise has been described as being among the greatest in a century of exceptional women, a claim I find no reason to disagree with. Of Marguerite some years later, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, said he found her the most frank and wise woman he ever spake with, and he spake with a few in his time. Mother and daughter were women of letters, arts and books, readers and authors thereof. Leonardo da Vinci was attracted to and subsequently became a member of the court circle and a neighbour at Amboise. Both women were keen politicians and seasoned negotiators. The king counted them among his closest advisors. Louise would on more than one occasion act as his regent in his absence. And then the third person, Anne de Boulogne, what an enigma she is. We don't even know where or when she was born. But in that era, to modern study at least, she is almost as famous as King Henry VIII himself. Catherine was married to Henry for something like 21 or even 27 years, depending on which criteria you use to determine the end of the marriage. How long was Anne married to Henry? Well, somewhere in the region of 3 years or so, dependent on when you judged the marriage to have begun. But whatever the exact dates were, whichever way you look at it, it's a difference of more than 20 years. But despite that, the number of book pages devoted to Anne, both fiction and non-fiction, dwarf those dedicated to Catherine. And until very, very recent times, Catherine has been pretty well ignored by the film industry. So why is Anne so famous? Infamous, if you like. Was she the marriage breaker, or the unfortunate wife of a cruel, tyrannical king? Or perhaps her role in the reign of Henry VIII is overstated, to a point where history itself is distorted. Well, we are where we are, and to some, Henry's wives and Anne de Boulogne in particular are the most important factors to consider during the reign. The first of the world-changing events during the reign of Henry VIII that made it so famous begin to occur in earnest from 1521. So in the next episode, we'll continue the backstory that leads to 1521. But before we do that, in episode 2, we'll spend some time, quite a lot of time actually, looking at the events of the early life of the enigmatic Anne de Boulogne. And we'll discuss her background, which becomes increasingly relevant to our understanding of the later
1520s and the early 1530s. So, I hope to see you next time in the Loire Valley in the episode called Under Boulogne and on to 1521. And thank you for watching.